with all the Ghostbusters films, there was been a lot of behind the scenes stories or rumor or conjecture about stuff. How serious were they about maybe getting Eddie Murphy in the first movie? What were the different iterations of Ghostbusters 2? And it was kind of stuff like that I really wanted to dig into and kind of present all the evidence and maybe the truth is somewhere in between. And I also felt it was important to kind of put this all in a cultural context. A lot of those articles are well, Ghostbusters came out and was the biggest thing since sliced bread. Well, what did that mean? What was its lasting power? And where did it fall in the evolution of Hollywood? And why was it so difficult to get a third movie made?
Hello and welcome to Good Journeys with Second Mountain. This is the podcast that shines a spotlight on inspiring people and their inspired stories. Please do join in the conversation with us on social media using the hashtag GoodJourneysPod. And you can find each and every episode of our show over at our YouTube channel via the Good Journeys Pod hashtag. I'm your host, Ben Veal, founder of Second Mountain Comms, helping good people do good. And today's episode is a very special one for me, as we'll be turning our attention to a movie franchise that's inspired millions around the world for close to 4 decades now. My guest today is James Greene Jr., author of A Convenient Parallel Dimension, How Ghostbusters Slimed Us Forever. James's book has been described by reviewers as the addictively written, utterly engrossing read that ghost heads have been waiting for since 1984. The new book charts the evolution and up and down story of the Ghostbusters franchise and the people involved in its success. A freelance writer based in Texas, James has previously authored The Complete Story of the Misfits and Brave Punk World, and has written for a host of publications, including Orlando Weekly. James, that was your big intro. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you.
Very good.
I want to point out, since publishing my first book, This Music Leaves Stains, The Complete Story of the Misfits, it's not complete anymore because they decided to reunite with their original singer. So I need to add in that caveat where it's not really complete anymore. But
the incomplete story of the Misfits.
It's pretty close to complete.
I think that's crying out for a revised edition, isn't it, then?
Yeah, at some point. Yeah. But thank you for having me on the podcast. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Well, look, I mean, we've talked lots offline, but I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was tremendous.
Well, thank you.
Why did you choose to write a book all about Ghostbusters? What attracted you to this project?
Well, I've always been a huge Ghostbusters fan, and I felt like there wasn't a book like this that really told the entire story, not just of how they made the movies, but how the talent came together and what the cultural impact was, and just the long wait we had for a third Ghostbusters. It just felt like there was a huge tale to tell, and there were certainly a lot of really cool official books have been published, but I felt like there was nothing that really kind of collected all the bits and pieces and all the all the stuff that was out of the official story. So I did it.
So you did it, and what a story you've done. I mean, you said in the book that you became an instant fan when you watched, the first Ghostbusters as a kid. I think that's a reaction that many of us had upon first view, and I always remember that first time just being blown away, and that feeling hasn't really ever stopped in almost 40 years. What is it to you, James, that makes that first movie such an instant classic?
That's something I thought about a lot over the course of my life, and certainly when I'm working on this book. And I think that there were two reviews of the film when the film was released. There were two critical reviews that kind of captured what it is exactly. In Roger Ebert's review, he talks about how it's not just funny; it mixes a lot of different kinds of comedy. It's not just like Saturday Night Live style comedy. It's there's sarcasm, and there's in jokes, and there are weird twists on sort of American idioms. So it's kind of like a weird grab bag, like a potpourri of different kind of comedic styles.
Sure.
And then I think in New York Magazine, David Denby wrote this movie is it has the same kind of thrills of a Dragnet style show like those like the blaring sirens of like the 1950s or 60s like straight laced cop shows, but there's also that weird sci-fi element of like from the same era where people are like waving wands at plants and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's also tapping into the like parody of like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. It's just it's sort of like a layered mix of stuff. But like just on the surface level, and I think Ivan Reitman said this at one point. It's like these people seem really fun to hang out with, and they're doing something cool.
Yeah.
They're doing something. The iconography of Ghostbusters is very appealing. And that all just kind of comes together. But I think ultimately, it's like these are people and characters that like you feel like you want to hang out with. And certainly, when I was a kid, I felt that way, and it was like I recognized that a lot of it was sort of adult humor, or maybe wasn't kind of going it
Mm.
was going over my head, or I wasn't connecting with it, but it was still like I recognize this as humorous, and there's something appealing to me about that.
That's one thing that amazes me, because I would have been probably 5 when I watched it first. I remember finding the whole thing hilarious, and I
Mhm.
look at it now, I didn't have a clue what was going on. The first Ghostbusters is a genuinely adult movie. That most of the humor is focused at adults, not kids, but it
Mhm.
just manages to tap into. You'd never see a film made like that now with those kind of jokes. Well, obviously for political correctness, but you wouldn't see the kind of humor and the sophistication that's in the first Ghostbuster in a
I
family
think
film anymore, I don't think.
also just like that kind of that style of humor has kind of changed and evolved, and to some degree evaporated, where it's like you're just not going to get something like that. Like it's
Mm.
the like Bill Murray and Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd had their own rhythm and style, and it's you won't find it anywhere else. I think is you know
And that's something I loved about the book. For anyone listening that hasn't read it yet, I love the fact that it's a very layered book. So you spend a lot of time before we even get to Ghostbusters in '84, talking about the evolution of the lead actors, talking about Ivan Reitman's portfolio, talking about the Saturday Night Live explosion, everything that came before. So by the time we got to Ghostbusters, you had this cast of characters that just knew one another's comedic timing so well,
Mhm.
didn't you?
Yeah, and that was something that Ernie Hudson said was difficult when he was working on the movie. Was like it was they talked to each other like a family, where they could communicate in ways that were foreign to him, alien to him, which I guess kind of served his character. But he felt it was also, it was difficult,
Mm.
connecting with them, and yeah, I mean it's kind of easy to forget that just how long they'd all been like working together, or how long they'd been intertwined or in the same comedy scene.
Who was your Ghostbuster as a kid?
My favorite was Harold Ramis, definitely Egon.
Yeah,
You know, I felt like he was the coolest. Obviously, he was the smartest.
yeah.
So, and he didn't seem to really. He didn't like. I guess none of them really cracked under pressure, but he definitely kind of seemed to hold it together a little bit more
Yeah, it
than the rest.
kind of rises above it all, doesn't it? As we'll kind of come on to when we talk about Afterlife later, but kind of always, as you say, keeping a kind of cool, calm head in a storm. And yeah, I was always a Peter man, I think, back in the early days. But interestingly, as years have progressed, it's moved on to Winston very much so. I just
Mm,
think he has to fight and graft so much for his share of everything,
yeah.
really, the Ghostbusters empire. Obviously there have been many, many books and articles written about Ghostbusters over the years. Obviously, you've talked about kind of those various official ones and where you slot in. What do you think your book adds to what's already out there?
Well, I think there's a lot of in the official Ghostbuster stuff, it's always kind of like they hit these bullet points where it's like, well, Ivan Reitman had directed, Animal House, and he'd done this and that. It's like it always kind of starts at Animal House, and to me, it's like, well, what? He had a whole segment of his life before that. How did he get to Animal House? Or how did Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd get to Saturday Night Live? Like, why didn't Harold Ramis go to Saturday Night Live? Why did he go to SCTV? And all that stuff. And I think that I had no idea before I started work on this book that Ivan Reitman was one of the first filmmakers in Canada to be prosecuted for obscenity because of a
Mm.
film he produced in college. So
Yeah,
I
neither
think
did
that
I. That blew me
Yeah, that
away.
really that colors what happens to the rest of his career, I think, to a certain degree. So, and I think there's a lot of uh, with all the Ghostbusters films, there was been a lot of like, behind the scenes stories and rumor or conjecture about stuff like, like how serious were they about maybe getting Eddie Murphy in the first movie? Were they gonna, what was this? What were they? What were the different iterations of Ghostbusters 2? And it was kind of stuff like that I really wanted to dig into and like kind of present. Well, here's what all the evidence and let maybe the truth is somewhere in between. And I also felt it was important to kind of put this all in like a cultural context, because a lot of those articles are like, well, Ghostbusters came out and was the biggest thing since sliced bread. But I really wanted to like kind of chart, well, what did that mean? What was its lasting power and where did it fall like in the evolution of Hollywood? You know, and why was it so, why was it so difficult to get a third movie made? Uh, you know,
Absolutely. The kind of question that everyone's asked, and I think your book does such a great job of kind of pulling together that wider context of all the shifts that were happening in Hollywood, but also in society over that period, and making it very clear that Ghostbusters 3, as hoped, was never going to happen.
mhm.
I think Ghostbusters Afterlife was the closest we would ever get to that idea. But what fascinates me, I mean, we are talking about a franchise that's kind of burst onto the mainstream in 1984. Almost 40 years later, here we are talking about Ghostbusters, and its popularity shows absolutely no signs of slowing down. And we've now got new generations coming into the fold as well. What do you believe it is about Ghostbusters that is why it's had such a enduring appeal worldwide?
Well, I think it's a pretty fertile concept. I mean, like folklore about ghosts exists in every culture, and it's sort of like the one. I feel like in other movies about ghosts, they kind of just make them go away for a little bit, and this is like we're doing something concrete. We're trapping them in something, and we're putting them in a larger box.
And we're making money from it as well
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
same time.
yeah, and it's just it's not like rooted in like religion or like a mysticism like The Exorcist or Poltergeist or what have you. Like this is a concrete solution to a problem that everyone wonders about, and it's imaginative and you know and the car is really cool. I mean, it never hurts to have a really cool looking car.
No, it really doesn't. And I think what I love about it as well is it's, as you say, they're not busting ghosts for kind of altruistic reasons. They're doing it to make money, to run a business or an empire, and it really
Yeah,
taps into that kind of love again for the American dream, doesn't it, as well?
yeah.
And the underdogs and those that are kind of slightly shunned by society, that don't perhaps culturally quite fit in, these three misfit scientists who go on to, for a period of time, be beloved by all in New York City until suddenly they're not anymore, which takes us on to Ghostbusters 2. And I thought the book it's interesting reading the book and reading the critics and the summary you've pulled together of all of those that criticised Ghostbusters 2, of which there were many. You would come away from that chapter feeling in some ways like it is one of the worst films ever made. Yeah, I adore it. It's probably because of the time it came in my childhood. It is a very different beast. It is not the sophisticated romp that we saw in the first one, but I still think it holds up. What say you on Ghostbusters 2?
It's interesting because I kind of like fluctuate on. I think there's a lot of really funny stuff in it. I think there's a lot of kind of creative stuff in it. Um, I and like look, I think that this is something that people kind of lose sight of when they complain about the like how realistic like the narrative of a movie is. I feel like life is so unpredictable and you never know you're up or you're down. And so it's like sometimes I wonder, like,
You never know when a 17th century painting is going to become possessed, do you?
well, I mean, like the fact that the Ghostbusters 2 opens and like it seems the whole city has turned on them. That's like kind of like, I don't know, but that is something about that is a little more satisfying and feels a little more New York than like if they were
Do you
just
know what,
continuing.
that takes me off an interesting sidebar, because one of the things which I loved in your book and which also really shocked me was how much resentment there was towards the first Ghostbusters film during its production. Can you
Oh
talk
yeah.
about that a little bit more?
Oh yeah, sure, sure. And having I grew up like an hour outside of New York, and I lived in the city for a little while when I was an adult. And oh yeah, like the slightest change in the plan just like ruins everyone's day, like like commuting wise. And yeah, like I think one of the stories that is often repeated about their production is when they were filming in Columbus Circle and how that caused such a traffic nightmare, and New Yorkers are not going to put up with anything like that, and they don't care who you are. But there was also a lot of like rigmarole about trying to get locations where it's like, we don't, we don't want you filming here, we don't want you filming here, And I remember like from when I lived in Brooklyn, like in God, like 2008 to 2013 or so, and it's like, yeah, I mean, you never get any warning that this stuff is happening. Like maybe a day before, there'll be a sign that says, "Hey, we're filming the Smurfs movie here. The street's gonna be totally blocked off. You're not gonna be able to get anywhere,"
Sure.
or like I remember I couldn't get into my bank quite often because Law and Order loved to film like right on that corner, and I was like, "You can't go to the bank today, sorry." Uh, so yeah, and I mean, certainly, it's also another thing that's kind of hard to fathom at this point in time is like a lot of people didn't think Bill Murray or Dan Aykroyd were all that funny or like even liked them that much. So when people are like, "Oh, Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd are here filming a movie in the middle of like the most congested part of Manhattan," they're like, "Yeah, oh wow, even more reason to dislike them.
Yeah.
They're unfunny and they're causing me problems in my work life." So
And yet, little did they know, but actually, it's a film that I think for many would spawn a real love affair for New York City. And I think you touched on it, but 5 years later, the the backlash wasn't quite so when it came to Ghostbusters 2. Is that correct?
yeah, that's right. They were more forgiving, but I think at least like into the '90s, Dan Aykroyd was still complaining on how much the city taxed them on the first Ghostbusters. He's like, "I'm going to be paying those taxes the rest of my life." Uh, so yeah, but certainly they didn't have as many production issues when they were filming the second one.
Sure. Well. One thing I'd love to talk about is the kind of approach you took to the journey of writing this book. So you've written a convenient parallel dimension. It's impeccably researched, and as you say, kind of right in the intro of the book, it's a story that's about much more than just Ghostbusters. You spent 300 odd pages here covering the evolution of Hollywood and kind of American pop culture more widely, really. Um, as a writer, how did you approach such a wide remit in one book?
I just I read as much as I possibly could about Hollywood and that era, and it was I approached it like I need to write much more than I plan to put in the book or try to, so I can just kind of like take stuff out. I'm not scrambling looking for stuff. And honestly, like it was tough to be like, because there were so many interesting facets and tributaries, and already there are plenty of people who are like, who have kind of lobbed criticism of the book and saying like, yeah, you're spending too much time talking about stuff that isn't Ghostbusters. But I feel like that's kind of important, to give it the context that I was speaking of before, and just to follow the stories of these people's lives. I spent a lot of time, at the library or communicating with the library or, using the online library tools, and, collecting lots of old books.
Were you writing it during the course of the pandemic?
Yeah, it actually started just before the pandemic. Like, well, I mean, I wanted to I had the idea to do this. right after the publication of my first book, but that was in 2013, and that didn't work out then. And but it when they announced Afterlife, I went back to my publisher and I was like, can we maybe revisit this Ghostbusters book idea? They're like, yeah. So I got off the ground then, and yeah, I was working, all through this historical event.
And how was that kind of writing from home? Did that provide some kind of much needed escapism during that weird period?
I mean, yeah, to some degree, like it was still work. But it was kind of like a mixed blessing because, my son is a special needs kid and he needs a lot of help. And, I, before the pandemic, I did take, I went out to Los Angeles for a couple of days to do research, and it was good. Like I accomplished stuff, but I was also like, I don't feel good. Like, being
Mm.
away from like, yeah, I want to be here to help as much as I can. Thankfully, a lot of like institutions that had materials and information that was vital to working on this book were like, yeah, like we can work out something here where we send you the materials, or you can do it online. So because at first it was looking like I'm gonna have to go to Los Angeles and New York and back to Los Angeles and here, there, this, that.
So do you think it in a way it made the process easier, the fact that the world was kind of locked down to a degree and travel was so challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there should be. I think stuff like that, like online access to these databases, should have always been that transparent. Because there are people who can't, who want to do this work who can't, like people like my son who can't, easily get out somewhere. So yeah, I mean, it did make it easier in that sense. The weight and the pressure of all, it was still like, it wasn't like I was totally sealed in the vacuum. It was like all this stuff. And every time I would interview somebody or talk to somebody on the phone, like it would always be like, so what's your situation like? What's COVID like where you are? Like,
Yeah.
are you leaving the house? What's going on? I spent as much time talking about that as I did Ghostbusters when I'd be like interviewing people.
Yeah, sure. And I guess you also had this kind of ever shifting kind of date of when Afterlife would see the light of day as well. I think you've done a great job in the book of summarizing. It's a little time capsule, really, that bit where you're talking about the theatres closing and the James Bond release and the shifting and the Black Widow lawsuit and all of that kind of fascinating little pocket of Hollywood history. But of course, were you originally working to a deadline of say towards the end of 2020, thinking that was when Afterlife would come out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the original plan, and I would have to check the contracts. I think originally the plan was like, yeah, it'll come out, just a few months after Afterlife, in 2020. And I was the publisher was very kind to stick with me when I was like, I need to include Afterlife. I need to see it and write about it. That's going to be important. And eventually they're like, well, why not? Yeah, everything else is delayed. Why the hell not? They were very accommodating in that sense, but it was obviously very frustrating because it's like I want to get this done. I want to.
Yeah.
I mean, but at the same time, and I've said this before, it's like with all my books, I feel like, oh, I could easily spend another 5 years working on this and making it better.
Yeah.
But
there's a point where you have to draw the line, isn't there? And just say,
yeah,
that's good enough.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was pretty crazy, and it was sort of difficult to believe I was even seeing it as I was watching it. It was like, it was kind of hard to be like, all right, I kind of need to focus, but this is also very strange that I'm actually finally seeing this.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember being in the theatre watching Afterlife and having that moment, just thinking, I can't believe, not only that I'm in a cinema watching this after everything that's happened, but I just can't believe this is actually happening, to be honest. But we'll come to that. I'm not going to jump ahead just yet to there. I'm really curious to kind of find out about maybe some of the learnings you took away from writing this book, because, you said at the start that you are, first and foremost, a fan of Ghostbusters, and that's what led you to writing this. But at the same time, this is not a book that shies away from talking about some of the more negative aspects, both in terms of the production and also the behaviour of, some of its stars, whilst you're obviously countering that with the many positives. So I'm wondering, did authoring this book change your perspective on Ghostbusters in any way? Or, have you come out of this being as much of a fan as you were when you went in?
Yeah, I would say I'm as much as a fan as always. I think like the stuff I learned wasn't like when in terms of like individual behaviors and personalities and negative stuff like that. I wouldn't say anything really surprised me or changed my. It's like, yeah, everybody knows Bill Murray is a huge jerk, and everybody kind of. I mean, I guess I didn't really know too much about Ivan Reitman personally. I heard good and bad things working on, and it's like when I interviewed Peter Giuliano, who was the first AD on Ghostbusters 1 and 2, he's like, the thing you got to remember is like, different people see different sides of other people, at different times, some people have positive experiences, other people have negative experiences. And so it's like, you kind of have to keep that in mind where it's like, some
Yeah.
people would say like, oh, this person was great. This person was bad. There were even people who were like, oh, Bill Murray was wonderful. I loved working with him. He was, and people like below the line people, like the the technical people, like, he was great. He was great.
It's also funny how people's memories can change with time, isn't it? Like kind of maybe what happened at the time, you look back at it with 20 years later, 30 years later, and your perspective on that situation has shifted with age. There's probably an element of that going on as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, they're the only people who have experienced anything like that. They're the only people who were in Ghostbusters who worked on Ghostbusters. So it's like, you kind of have that. Okay, the biggest shock or the thing that one element where my expectations were totally flipped upside down was when I interviewed Yaphet Kotto, because I had heard that he had been offered a role in Ghostbusters and he had been offered a role in one of the Conan the Barbarian movies at the same time.
Okay.
And I reached, but he was doing a TV show here as well. And it was like this, and I reached out to him and I was like, oh, I'd love to, I'm writing this book and I'd love to hear maybe why you turned it down, why you turned down Ghostbusters, what was happening, and he wrote me back. He's like, all right, I'm ready to talk about why I turned down Ghostbusters. And I was like, okay. And the tenor of it suggested like this might be a serious story. Like this might be like, maybe he encountered some racism or prejudice or something. Like, I went into it like, okay, let's listen to what the man has to say, and then so let's try to, it could be a heavy conversation.
Sure.
But and then he's like, immediately he's like, James, I turned down Ghostbusters because I didn't want aliens to visit me anymore, because aliens have been visiting me all my life, and whenever I do a science fiction movie, the aliens come back, and like I don't want that in my life. And I was like, oh, okay,
Okay.
all right, well, let's talk about that. So that was some very like he's like, Ghostbusters is real, it's not phony, like it's all real, that stuff is real, and he's telling me about all these experiences with like utter conviction, and I'm like, this is mind-blowing. So
Wow.
that was like one thing where it's like I was not expecting that at all.
No.
So
yeah, that's a very different kind of conversation, isn't it?
yeah, but yeah, everything else was like there was nothing that was like, I mean, there were elements of their story, like I said, like I didn't know about Ivan Reitman's legal troubles, when with that film before everything, or like stuff like that. But that was in terms of like completely altering my perspective about anything. That was like the big thing.
Yeah, I was really interested in the kind of Ghostbusters 2 script revisions and how, initially Dana, Sigourney Weaver's character, was not factored into that in any way. And it's really interesting to see the evolution of how that shifted.
Mm-hmm.
I always find it fascinating to think about what a film could be that you've grown to love and has become such a big part of your life. And also, I mean, just fascinating to kind of hear how some of the latter iterations for what was supposed to be Ghostbusters 3 bear such a close similarity to what we ultimately got with Afterlife. There's a lot of kind of tonal and narrative elements to that you can really see.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we didn't get quite the film we expected, but we certainly got a very close version of it, I think, based on the discussions that we had at points. It's also fascinating to read some of the completely bonkers ideas for Ghostbusters 3 from Dan Aykroyd's incredible mind.
Yeah. One of the top questions I get since the book was published was like, can you send me all those Ghostbusters 3 scripts you read? And the answer is no, I can't. I won't. But also, you don't want to read them. They're not good. They're like crazy. So, like, oh my God. Yeah, just really off the wall and not like funny.
No, that's the thing, that from the summaries you put in the book, none of them sound particularly fun. They sound dark.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, one film that wasn't dark but maybe received criticism for being too light was Answer the Call. And I was really fascinated by the chapter on this. I shared this one with my wife, who also really enjoyed reading it. Who isn't massively a Ghostbusters fan, but has had to become one through 15 years of marriage to me. But Answer the Call, the 2016 female-led Ghostbusters reboot, it's fair to say it very much divided fans worldwide, even a long time before it was released. And I think you've done a really great job here of giving very rounded context to that film, kind of its origins, the criticism that it received, but also how its release kind of fed into this widening kind of cultural divide that was happening in society at the time, kind of UK having Brexit, US on the cusp of Trump. Looking back now, especially with Afterlife being in the Ghostbusters canon, what are your feelings on Answer the Call? And I guess, what do you think its legacy will be? And do you think it's been treated disproportionately unfairly?
I think that people certainly people are really rough, like much rougher on it than they should be. I think, yeah, I think like Ghostbusters 2, there's a lot of elements in it that are funny. There's a lot of stuff that's interesting and fun. I don't, but I think I kind of mentioned this in the book. It's sort of like they didn't really do too much different from like what had been established. And it's just something I kind of have mixed feelings about. I think it's awesome that they did that, and it's awesome that it's like a different. It's also like a different kind of humor, a different approach to the humor or the comedy. I don't, I'm not like a lot of people seem to be at war with people who like it. I'm really a big like punk rock fan, and I love like the idea of like, yeah, no sacred cows, no heroes, tear everything down, let's just do whatever, who cares? And that's kind of my feeling about it. It's like, no, it's not like the funniest thing in the world. And it's like, it could have been a lot more creative, but it's still fun. And it's, and like, but I also at the same time I kind of wonder like, well, what? I kind of feel like Paul Feig had his Ghostbusters with Bridesmaids, and I don't. To me, it's like I don't. It seems like they kind of like were like Sony was really pushing to get something Ghostbusters made, and like they kept going back to him, and it kind of feels like they pressured him into it to some degree.
That's it. That's interesting. But he had his Ghostbusters moment with Bridesmaids, because I think that for me was the prevailing thought when I came out of watching Answer the Call, and I enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed it much more on subsequent viewings, especially since Afterlife's been out, because I think I can now view it in a different way. But for me, the humor in it just wasn't as sophisticated as it could have been, especially with the cast of characters and fantastic actors that were part of Answer the Call. I think it's off a beat, and it's to compare it and Bridesmaids is like chalk and cheese. They're so far removed, and it's that was the impression I got from reading your book too, that it was a bit like, okay, I'll make a Ghostbusters film. Clearly, someone's getting to, as opposed to maybe that real labor of love that I don't know if that's possible to achieve a labor of love in Hollywood anymore. But it's with something of that big budget, with that many expectations on it. But I think it's been very unfairly cast aside by so many people, and I think it's still, there's a lot of merits to it. There are things wrong with it, but there's things wrong with every film. But I feel sad for the cast involved, that it's almost a little bit like it's been written out of the Ghostbusters history book. And I thought that your book did a really good job of contextually putting its valid place in the Ghostbusters legacy.
Oh, thanks. There's so many people who just like screaming, like they're so upset, like they made this instead of Ghostbusters 3.
Okay, well, with that, what did you think of Afterlife then?
Afterlife was a lot better than I was expecting it to be. I was very entertained, very like engaged with it. I think that the kids in it were also good together, and I think that that was all. They were also great, and their adventure together was so appealing and fun and dynamic in certain ways. They didn't need to bring the original Ghostbusters back. Like I kind of felt like we were getting to that part of the movie, and I knew they were going to be in it, and I was almost like, good. Can we wait a little bit longer? I think it's more fun just to have these kids, you know? I mean, I guess any version of Ghostbusters 3, like the only like really fertile concept is like, oh yeah, one of the Ghostbusters has to die and become a ghost. Unfortunately, Harold Ramis did pass, and I don't know. I mean, I kind of have mixed feelings about what they did, you know, using his image or his ghost so heavily in it at times. But you know, overall, I think it's like, you know, it was good. It's a good movie, you know.
I think again it comes back to that kind of first viewing. I mean, obviously we're watching Ghostbusters now through cynical adult eyes that have seen a lot, but you have to kind of put aside to how you would have felt if you were watching that as a child, like we did all those years ago. I mean, I certainly came out of the cinema having managed to avoid a lot of spoilers intentionally for about 2 years and really trying to kind of keep away from as much about it as I could, just to kind of preserve that moment. Yeah, I came out of it feeling that it was a very, very special film in many regards. I've since kind of, read up a lot more about its production, and there was just such a meticulous level of detail to so many of those kind of little moments and factors that make the film what it is. It's not perfect, and I know the ending has divided a lot of people. There was something very, very surreal about seeing the original Ghostbusters back, albeit in a way that we wouldn't have expected necessarily. And it just kind of made me think, just kind of had me come away thinking, I wonder how much they lived with some of those stars. I'm talking about, Murray and Aykroyd, and how much they wish they'd done it years before, just dusted off the proton packs and just made it happen, or whether it wouldn't have happened without Harold's passing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, who knows? Like, they all kind of present their front about it, like Bill Murray has avoided like the plague, and Dan Aykroyd has always made it sound like he's raring to go. I think who knows how they really feel, how they, I'm sure that there was some element of like regret maybe after Hal Ramis died, but I feel like Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray probably have had very few days in their lives since 1984 where someone does not ask them about Ghostbusters. And I'm sure as proud of it as they are, they've done lots of other stuff, and they probably, enjoy having a break from thinking about it,
So in your view, kind of ideal world, we've got Firehouse announced for, I think, kind of December 2023 or thereabouts. In an ideal world, we've passed the torch now fully onto the next generation. Let's not look back at what's come before.
Putting the Ghostbusters, putting Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd and Ernie Hudson in the new movies, it's a bit like, I don't know if they aired this in the UK, but there was a commercial here a few years ago where E.T. comes back to visit Elliot and his family.
Okay.
And it was like an ad for like a cell phone or like a tablet or something, and it's like E.T. is back to hang out with Elliot on Christmas morning, and it was like so like.
Was it Elliot? Was it Elliot as a grown up?
Yeah. And it was like, I don't know, man. It's just something about it just kind of struck me so weird. And
it's a bit like, I remember when they did a similar advert. I can't remember what it was for in the States, but it was they got the band of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation back together, Chevy Chase and co, all back together in a room. And yeah, you just kind of go, kind of prefer to remember you
Yeah, I mean,
in that moment in time, really.
yeah, and when you have these kids who are so appealing on their own, and I thought they made a lot of you know, smart, like not cliche choices with
Mm.
like how those kids' stories and their journeys and everything. Um, when you have all that, it's like I don't know, and it felt in Afterlife like almost like they like there was all that stuff at, like in the after credit scenes where like
Mhm.
Winston is like doing a monologue in the firehouse, and it kind of feels like they were did like maybe they cut a bunch, maybe they cut all that out of the movie, and then people were like, no, put that back in. People want to see them, and
Yeah.
like it just felt like there were editing issues in that regard. But yeah, I feel like
The Bill Murray and Sigourney Weaver bit in the credits just it's
yeah, that was
tonally has no link to any of the rest of the
yeah,
film.
yeah. It all kind of felt like yeah, it all sort of felt like what is the point of this? And even when they show up, when there's no like suddenly they just materialize in their
Yeah.
jumpsuits. um, so yeah, I feel like just move forward. Thought they did a good job of that, like in the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. There were threads that they just dropped or they didn't. All the Batman movies in Batman Returns they don't explain. We don't see the Joker's funeral. like
No.
it's
Yeah.
like, I don't know.
But it feels like we're in this real era of nostalgia. With so many franchises, it feels like we've got to kind of squeeze a little bit more out of the
And
franchise.
certainly we're in an era where everyone wants an explanation for everything.
Mm.
Everybody like don't leave it up to my imagination. Tell me what happens, like where show me.
Yeah, I'll probably go to my grave saying I think the best ending of a series ever was The Sopranos. You can probably tell which camp I fall into when it comes to ambiguity. One thing I loved with Afterlife, of many things I loved, but one thing I really loved was Phoebe. I mean, my son's autistic, and we've been through a journey over the last few years of kind of talking lots about autism with him, learning about autism and his place in the world. And whilst it's not really overtly labeled as such, Phoebe's character, I just thought it was really encouraging. My wife and I kind of came out of that saying how encouraging it was to see such a strong, confident, funny young female protagonist in that role.
Yeah,
And I think that's a really big step forward for not just the Ghostbusters franchise, but hopefully for family films in Hollywood generally. Just there's never the sense really that Phoebe's the butt of the joke. She's incredibly cool the entire film,
yeah,
and she's just got such a handle on it. The fact that I think you describe it in a book, the fact that she just picks up a proton pack and just gets on with it. There isn't the kind of scenes we saw in Answer the Call where they have to make a fool of themselves before they can use it. She just intuitively understands the technology and knows what she's doing. And as
yeah.
such, I think she's there's a lot of power in her performance. And I'm really excited as a fan to see where that group of characters go next and where they take the films now. But talking of what's next, you obviously don't want to go via the way of Bill Murray and still being asked about your book in 40 years' time. What comes after writing about Ghostbusters? Have you got another project on the horizon, James?
Oh, I do. Oh, it isn't. It's not just on the horizon. It's lurking much closer. I'm working on a book about the 15 years Guns N' Roses spent making Chinese Democracy, uh, which I don't know if people even remember Chinese Democracy. It was the Guns N'
Yeah.
Roses album we were all waiting for. And it was kind of when Axl Rose was going through his Howard Hughes phase, and it's one of those things where it's like, I remember living through it and being like, yeah, like this is not going to get any more insane. Like each rumor, each story you heard about was crazier than the last, and I was like, someone's got to write a book about this. So I'm doing that, and luckily another branch of the publisher is going to put it out in a couple of years.
So sticking with the music theme, do you think you'd return to doing another trip through a cinematic franchise at some point?
I might. I mean, I've definitely thought about it. I've had a few ideas of tackling other stuff like that. But after I finished the first book that I wrote, I feel like I needed a break from writing about music. But then you never know how inspiration is going to hit you. You know, I had this idea for this Chinese democracy book a few years ago. In fact, I was working on the proposal for it and trying to shop the proposal around to different places when they announced Afterlife. And suddenly I was back on the Ghostbusters, and I was like, oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. To answer your question, maybe.
So where can everyone listening today keep in touch with your latest news? I know you've left Twitter. Is that correct?
I have. Well, I guess the best place is my blog, which is jgtwo.com, jg2.com.
Where's the best place to buy the book online? I think in the UK it is. I saw it was available in WH Smith's and Waterstones. It's, and obviously Amazon.
Even before the release date for the UK, the January 1st release date, all the copies had already been sold out or reserved. So there's already delays, like even like at places like Waterstones. And I want to apologize I'm just as frustrated by that but I'm also thrilled that everyone's so interested in it, and the publisher is sending more books ASAP.
Well, here it is. I'm obviously one of the lucky ones in the UK to have a copy. Kept me very, very entertained over the festive season. I was literally glued to it. And I can't recommend it enough. And I know that it's a book that I'm going to return to time and again. So thank you, James, for kind of filling in so many of those gaps and answering so many of those questions that I've always wondered about over the years.
Well,
any final words or thoughts before we wrap up?
I'm glad that you enjoyed the book so much. I'm flattered. that anyone enjoys it and likes it. And
no, we'll check back when Firehouse is out. We need to know. Maybe there'll be time for an additional part to the book at that point.
Yeah, it's in the contract that I signed to do an update at some point. But I don't know, that's all. I mean, the only experience I have that is with my first book, and they're kind of I think it's kind of dependent on sales because they're sort of well, you'd have to pitch us on doing the first book, updating the first book,
sure,
which sells okay. It sells pretty good.
Yeah,
but I don't know. Yeah, we'll see whenever Firehouse is out.
Yeah. Well, everyone listening to this, if you're a fan of Ghostbusters, if you've ever been intrigued by the story behind it, James's book, A Convenient Parallel Dimension, is I would say, the definitive guide to all things Ghostbusters. So thanks to you, James, for joining me for today's conversation. For everyone listening, if you've liked the show today, then please share it with others who might benefit from the conversation too. And don't forget to let us know what you think via the hashtag GoodJourneysPod. All past episodes of the show are available now via our website, which is secondmountaincoms.co.uk/podcast. And we're on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, pretty much any way you can think of to fill your head with podcasting wonderment. So that's it for today. Thank you for joining me and James. This has been the Good Journeys with Second Mountain podcast. So until next time, let's keep climbing together, and we'll see you all again soon.